Everyone to the 18th meeting of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee. Before we begin, can I remind members, witnesses and staff present that social distancing measures are in place in committee rooms and across the Holyrood campus. I ask that all take care to observe these measures over the course of this morning's business, including when entering and exiting the committee room. Our sole item of business today is our fourth evidence session on race, equality, employment and skills. We'll have 3 panels today. I welcome witnesses on our first panel, David McGill, Chief Executive from the Scottish Parliament, and Anila McKenna, Diversity, Inclusion and Wellbeing Manager from the Scottish Parliament. You're both very welcome this morning. We have a lot to get through and limited time available, so I'd ask members and witnesses to keep questions and answers as succinct as possible and tend to allow up to 45 minutes for this witness panel. So without further ado, if I can start with the first question. You said in your submission to the committee that in response to COVID-19, you're making sure your minority ethnic staff feel safe and their needs are met. Can you explain to the committee what you've done and what you plan to do in the longer term? And if I could go to David first, please. David.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. One of the first thing that we did when the COVID pandemic struck was to set up all of our staff to continue to support parliamentary business from home. The vast majority of our staff have been working at home for the last 6 months. And one of the things that I was quite keen to emphasise to them all was that their well-being was our top priority. Shortly after that, evidence started to emerge that BAME colleagues were being disproportionately affected by the virus. So we, as part of our first wellbeing survey, which we ran in May, we included questions on ethnicity in that survey. And at that point, we had reports back that our BAME colleagues felt well supported by the organisation, but there was some trepidation about return to work. At that point, it wasn't clear when we would be returning to work, but they expressed concern about returning to a working environment, whenever that would be. So, because we had that information, we designed, as part of our ongoing wellbeing support to staff, a system of one-to-one conversations with line managers. And ethnicity was part of those discussions. So we're going through a process just now that will conclude by the end of October, when every single member of staff is mandated to complete an individual wellbeing assessment, and the returns from those assessments will be made to HR, and HR will then analyse those. We'll pick that up again in our second rerun of the wellbeing survey, which we intend to run in November. So that's the main way that we've tried to drill down and make sure that there's a specific focus on BAME colleagues, as well as a general focus on all colleagues' wellbeing.
Anila, do you have anything to add? I suppose colleagues on committee might be interested to hear about specific measures or assistance that have been given.
Yes, myself as the Diversity Inclusion Manager, I personally have been very involved with the Black and Minority Ethnic Network that has been set up in the Parliament, and a number of our BAME colleagues sit on that network. I've checked in with them throughout COVID to give reassurances that we're here for them, also providing guidance that the Scottish Government has produced around, for example, helping issues that might be in families, for example, English as a second language, be able to look at COVID guidance in other translated formats. And also there was concerns about, as David has mentioned, around coming back to work. So we have given reassurances about that, and we had the opportunity, David and I, to meet with the BAME network earlier this week to talk through their concerns, and we have some specific actions that we will follow up on the basis of that. I think the main thing was to give them reassurances that our work on diversity hasn't ended. Obviously COVID has impacted on our diversity and inclusion objectives, but we wanted to give reassurances that we are still working towards our commitments to addressing the ethnic diversity of the workforce in the Parliament.
Thank you. If I could go to Fulton McGregor now, please. Fulton.
Thanks, Convener. The committee's been asking witnesses, you might be aware, about if their organisation has ever considered institutional racism as a factor when developing recruitment policies. Now, we've had quite a broad range of answers on this. There's been a general acceptance that institutional racism is a societal problem, but maybe a reluctance from some of the organisations have been in front of us to acknowledge it as an issue for their own organisation, and others, more ready to tackle it head on. I'm just wondering if the Scottish Parliament has considered institutional racism to be a factor when you're developing recruitment policies.
Thank you, Fulton. David, did you catch all of that?
I did,
there,
thanks.
Yes, okay,
yes,
if we can go
yes,
to you,
I did.
please.
Yeah, it's something that we do take very seriously. I think since the Macpherson report in 1999, it's brought a great focus to the issue of institutional racism, and we don't see ourselves in any way as immune from that. None of our indicators would suggest that we do have a problem, but we're very aware of the fact that indicators only take you so far. There may be issues with reporting issues, so we don't take that as a clean bill of health for the organisation. And what's driven a lot of our policy decisions has been the definition in the Macpherson report around about institutional racism being found in not just processes but in attitudes and behaviours. And that's led us to focusing much of our attention on our organisational values. In the last few years we have revamped completely our organisational values, and 2 of our 4 values are inclusion and respect. And the definitions of those talk about diverse perspectives, bringing diverse perspectives and fostering diversity and inclusion. Those have guided what has been a 4 or 5 year programme to completely revamp our recruitment processes. So the whole process now is values based. So right from the very beginning, from the designing of adverts for jobs to the recruitment process itself, our values permeate all of that. All of our recruitment literature has seen through the eyes of diversity. So instead of bold text-based approaches, we have much more diverse ways of looking at things. We have videos which include stories of people who already work here. We make sure that we have literature which shows how inclusive and open an organisation we are. And I think that's led to quite a lot of successes for the organisation in terms of diversity in the organisation.
Thank you. Fulton.
No, I'm happy with that, convener.
Okay. Anila, would you have had anything to add there? So you're very far away. It's hard for me to make eye contact.
That's okay. Yes, I would like to say also, we understand in the Parliament that racism manifests itself in many different ways. And, not just institutionally, but also at an individual level where Black and ethnic minority people, if you think about how they're growing up in an environment where they may experience racism, think about how that affects their confidence and ability. And we know, people might downplay their brownness, blackness when they come into organisations to be able to fit. So we've been very much working with our BAME colleagues in terms of their confidence building, thinking about their leadership capabilities. And also, racism is not just about individuals, institutions, it's also about our relationships as well at work. And so for us, David has talked about our values, but we've also got our, we're also working on our dignity and respect policy. It will mirror the sexual harassment policy that we have in place in the Parliament to take a zero-tolerance approach to any form of harassment, discrimination, bullying, victimisation. So we look at it at all levels and at a societal level. Cultural barriers, we know that there are cultural barriers in terms of people coming into the Parliament and may have different circumstances around family funerals and so on, and particular family events. So our special leave policy, for example, accommodates that to make sure that we address the needs of ethnic minority people within the Parliament.
Thank you. If I could go to Mary Fee now, please.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, David and Anila. I wanted to ask your views and thoughts on public accountability events, where public authorities would have the opportunity to come along. Committee would be there, stakeholders. It would be an opportunity for committee and stakeholders to question public authorities about the diversity of their workforce and what they're doing to increase the diversity in their workforce, with a view to developing a shared outcome or action plan. Is that something that you would see as beneficial?
David.
Yeah, I certainly would, yes. I mean, I think that's a really interesting idea, and I think it goes back to the lack of complacency that I talked about earlier, where we have metrics that are suggesting or telling us that we don't have a problem. I would like us to see us going to a different level of sophistication, and I think that ability to interact with other organisations, to be held to account for what we're doing, but also to tap into best practice so that we can continue to evolve and improve all of the processes and practices that we put in place. So it is something I would very much welcome.
Neela, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add.
No, there's not much I want to add to that. I think I very much agree with David. I would welcome that. I also think, you know, it helps break down barriers in the sense that people might have a perception of the Parliament being white because, you know, the elected membership, there is few black and minority ethnic people within the membership. So sometimes that then people may have a misunderstanding of the diversity within the Parliament itself. So I think from that perspective to be able to show that we are committed and to demonstrate the work we're doing, you know, and to be able to let organisations and communities know about that, we would very much welcome that opportunity.
Thank you. Mary, are you content?
If I could just very briefly follow up, just a supplementary question with David, please, Convener. One of the, I suppose, the concerns that has been raised when we've talked about this with previous panels is that there is always a danger when you hold events like this that we talk a lot but we don't actually get much out the other end. So the focus that is put on the theme of the event and how it's planned and how it's followed up is almost as important as the event itself. Is that something that you would agree with?
I think I would agree with that, and one thing that I would want to do in advance of us participating in any event like that is to talk to our BAME network colleagues about what outcomes they would want to see from that. The meeting that Anila referred to earlier on with them earlier this week was really instructive in terms of their perspective of working in an organisation like this. And one of the things that they brought to my attention I wasn't aware of was a report by the similar network in the Houses of Parliament of Westminster called Stand in My Shoes. And that whole report was about just surfacing how BAME colleagues feel working in a predominantly white organisation. So I think there's a real rich source of information that could guide our participation in an event like that, and it was something that I would quite want to tap into before our participation.
Okay, thank you.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
Alison Harris, if I could come to you, please.
Good morning. Increasing diversity of the parliamentary workforce is a key priority of the SPCB. In terms of increasing the numbers of BAME staff, there has been success through the Parliamentary Apprenticeship Scheme. But what other approaches have been taken and have they been successful?
The approaches we've taken have been successful. The apprenticeship scheme is the biggest success area for us, but we recognise that that was bringing people in at entry level and very much younger people as well, and that wasn't adequate for the diversity we want to see right across the organisation. So other things that we've done is we've created a temporary resourcing pool. Previously, our approach to temporary vacancies was very much to use employment agencies, but they weren't giving us the profile of staff that we required. So we've moved away from that completely, and we've created our own temporary resourcing pool, and that's given us access to the ability to make sure that flow of talent coming into the organisation is more diverse than it might otherwise have been. And that's important because quite often these temporary vacancies do evolve into permanent vacancies. So we want to make sure that the people we're bringing in may well be people that will stay with us longer term. Beyond that, we do have ongoing issues with BAME colleagues making their way through the organisation into more senior positions. So that's the main focus for us now that we've had successes at that level of bringing people into the organisation. We're switching our focus now to making sure that people stay with us and are able to progress their careers with us.
Would you have anything to add? Or?
Yes, just to add to that, I think in addition to our positive action work that we have been doing for Black and minority ethnic people, alongside that we are constantly reviewing and enhancing our recruitment practices. As David mentioned, we've been working on this for 5 years. It's been a long journey for us. I personally am part of the Human Resources Senior Management team. And so therefore I have an opportunity to advise my colleagues who are responsible for recruitment and retention within the Parliament. And that gives me an opportunity to make sure that they are embedding diversity and inclusion into their everyday practices. So, you know, our targets are not a standalone, it's part of our whole recruitment approach. And hopefully, if there will be an opportunity later to talk about recruitment, I can give you more detail about what we're doing in practice. But it is very much a part of our everyday activities. And I think from that point of view, that is all about attracting people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds and other diverse groups that are underrepresented in the Parliament.
Okay, thank you, Anila and David. Thank you.
David, I wonder if I could just briefly ask you, you mentioned there that there's still a challenge or a lot of work to be done in terms of moving people through the organisation. That would strike me that that's about whoever's recruiting for promoted positions. What work are you doing with not the BME colleagues to encourage them to apply, but with folk who are doing recruiting to make sure that any bias is addressed?
Yeah, well, the first thing we're doing is I referred to the recruitment process being driven by our values. So that values-based recruitment requires people who are doing the recruiting to be trained, and that's one of the commitments that we have for the next year, and it's one of the things that's unfortunately stalled because of COVID. So that's the main thing that we're doing. But we're also looking to develop a full improvement plan. As part of our annual reporting this year, we voluntarily ran a diversity pay gap alongside our gender pay gap, and that showed a gap of 21%, which is quite concerning. So we've committed to an improvement plan which involves leadership development training for BAME colleagues. So that's something that's under construction at the moment. We've also made contact with the John Smith Centre because they announced recently that they are launching a minority ethnic emerging leaders programme. So we're quite keen to partner with them if possible. And I see that as being a two-way process, not just getting people onto the programme that they're running, but offering the Scottish Parliament as a venue for that programme so that BAME colleagues from elsewhere can come into this organisation and experience the work that we offer here. And so I'm hoping that we can have a two-way benefit out of that engagement with the centre.
Thank you. It does still sound like it's about the individual employees rather than the organisation, but I did colleagues might want to pick up on that. Gillian Martin.
Good morning. I wanted to talk about or to get your view on positive actions and what your analysis is on the positive actions that you've put in place, both from the point of view of how successful they are and getting feedback, not just from those that have come through the recruitment process and been successful, but those who maybe have been unsuccessful. How do you monitor and analyse how successful your positive action measures have been?
Yeah, well, firstly, for us, positive action is the only answer to the issues that we've been addressing for the last 4 or 5 years, and I've got no qualms about taking positive action measures in that regard. I don't think the successes that we've had so far would have been delivered any other way, to be quite honest. And just to illustrate that, when we started looking at the profile of the organisation, the BAME profile was sitting just above 1%. Through positive action, and only through positive action, we've pushed that up to very close to 5%. But to me, that's almost like the bare minimum. We're just hitting that national average in Scotland, but that doesn't take account of the fact that the Central Belt, which is where we draw most of our employees from, BAME levels are higher than that, so we've got a lot more to do. But anytime we do take positive action, we do analyse the success of that. So in terms of recruitment, we look at every stage of the process, so from application to SIFT to recruitment. And our analysis there is showing that, I think that in the last full year, BAME applications were about 10%, through the SIFT 12%, and employment 19%. And that process has shown us that BAME applicants have outperformed white applicants in that last reporting year. And that starts to bring us into line with what we know in terms of educational attainment of BAME colleagues. And this has been a shift for us. So this is the first year, so we're looking to see if that is sustained. But as well as looking at the hard data, and the data is crucial here, we also seek direct feedback, and Anil has been active in doing that from colleagues. So we get good feedback from people who are not successful. It's not just speaking to people once we employ them about how they found the process. We do take time to speak to people who have come through the process and to examine what their experience of that whole process has been. And maybe Anila can say a wee bit more about that.
Turn to Anila for more detail on how you go about that.
Yes, so we've adopted a new recruitment candidate system. So in that system, when people register and when people apply for jobs, they're required to give us their diversity monitoring. So that allows us to look throughout the process when people are dropping off, you know. So for example, during SIFT, during interview, and once they're appointed. So we can monitor throughout every stage of that process. For the apprenticeship programme specifically, we did actually go back to the candidates to get feedback specifically from them, and we were able to capture that from the data from the system. So that has been really useful to do that. We plan to do more of that. That's in our commitments for January 2021. Is to get that specific feedback from candidates to ask them about the process and how they felt the process has gone for them. We know, for example, the values-based approach has been very positive for people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds, knowing that our values are in line with their values. So it's one of the things that it's one of the positive feedback messages that we got from black and ethnic minority people through that feedback process. I think I also want to mention that one thing in our improvement plan is not just HR looking at the data, it's actually giving the data to the group heads and office heads. So we've committed to that in our improvement plan. So for every recruitment competition, they will have an opportunity to look at, you know, how well black and minority ethnic people have done through that process, to be able to review that and to be identify, okay, where could there have been potential bias? What can we do differently next time? So that then helps mainstream it through the organisation for others to take responsibility within the business areas themselves as well.
Convener, can I follow up quickly? That recruitment's one thing, but retention's another. You've told us the figures around recruitment. In terms of retention and progression, how are the figures looking?
As an organisation as a whole, we have very good retention. That has challenges in terms of further diversifying the organisation, but our turnover rate is very low. It sits around about 5%, I think. It's maybe slightly above that. So retention hasn't been an issue for us. Progression I've talked about, which has been difficult to demonstrate that we have people moving into promoted posts. So that's going to be the next focus for us.
Alexander Stewart, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'd like to move on to the training aspect of things. You've talked about today how you want a diverse workforce and you want to ensure that they have dignity, respect. And you've also touched on the culture and maybe the perception of the Parliament as an organisation to outside. So when it comes to training of equality and diversity itself. When staff arrive at the building, is there a programme that you would set for them to ensure that they have that? And are there any specific roles within the Parliament that require more diversity and equality training? And if that is the case, what kind of refresher courses, what kind of training updates do people get to ensure that they keep up to pace with developments during the time that they are employed within the organisation?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, yes, all new starts go through a formal induction programme, and that includes training on diversity inclusion. It also involves a specific module on unconscious bias. So everyone that joins the organisation goes through that sometime within the first 6 months with us. In terms of ongoing training, Neil is probably better placed than I am to answer that part of the question.
Yes, you talked about areas where there may be more diversity training required, and I think what we have tried to do is it's not just about training. Training is not the only solution in terms of educating and being able to raise awareness of the issues, but it is through people's lived experience. And for us, we two particular areas where diversity training is important is around public engagement and our people management practices. So we have made effort to engage with black and minority ethnic people to learn from them specifically about what their challenges, what their barriers are. And we've done this, for example, through the Young Women Lead programme, which has 24 black and minority ethnic women on that. It's a programme about employment that the Parliament is involved in, and our black and minority ethnic colleagues sit on that programme and advise them around what it's like to work at the Parliament and so on, but also to get feedback from them about what challenges they think that they experience. And it was from that specific group that we actually found out about perception, and perception being a problem about the Parliament, because what we see is the political side, we don't see the employment side of what Parliament is about. The other aspect is the Black and Minority Ethnic Network. We provide a budget to them so that, it's not that they have to do all the work themselves, but they also have a budget, and they help educate and provide training to colleagues and using their own lived experience to tell those stories. So, for example, last year we had an educational talk around Ramadan, and colleagues learned considerable amount from that. And also we did a session around understanding racism in the workplace. So that again was very valuable, and we had our black and minority ethnic members support us in that.
And how do you evaluate all of that to make sure that it's covering across the whole of the Parliament?
So how we evaluate that is we look at our retention figures, of course, and as David had said, that our retention figures show that people do want to stay at the Parliament. Our temporary resourcing pool also suggests that people, even though they 27% of people have come from black and minority ethnic background have come through the temporary pool. So I think the problem for the Parliament is that we all like to stay where we are. There's a very low turnover in the Parliament, and that's one of the problems why it's been hard to bring people in. And I suppose we focused on our apprenticeship programme and our temporary resourcing pool, bringing in placements, unpaid, paid placements, because we have to find creative ways in which to bring people into the organisation. People don't want to leave. We like it here. So for us, it's very important that we can do that, and our retention rates certainly are constantly monitored to make sure that people aren't leaving the organisation.
Thank you.
I think that's a really interesting point you make about the perception of the Parliament based on the parliamentarians, and I know that all of us would acknowledge that our political parties have a bit of work to do to make us reflect our communities a bit better. Can I go to Alec Cole-Hamilton, please?
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, both David and Anila. Thank you for coming to see us today. I think I'd like to pick up on that, actually, this idea of if you can't see it, then you're less likely to be it. I think we're all aware of schemes that exist within the Parliament for the promotion of inclusion of people, particularly people with disabilities. So we have the Inclusion Scotland programme, which offers internships with MSPs. Firstly, can you give us an idea of how that relationship works with the Scottish Parliament itself? And secondly, whether there is, you've ever considered a similar scheme for internships for people who are black or minority ethnic?
To answer that. Yes, so we've worked with Inclusion Scotland for several years now. We've had a number of disabled people come in to work for members and also for the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body. They are paid internships, which is great and which is important as well. And that funding comes through Scottish Government to the Inclusion Scotland. But we provide the placement, we do the induction, we provide all the support, any adjustments, any work with access to work, we would take responsibility for that and support the member or support the manager in terms of supporting that individual. But I think more importantly, the recent communication from the Scottish Government about the John Smith Institute, and they'll be taking on 50 minority ethnic people to be part of their 9-month leadership development programme. And we would very much like to be part of that. David has actually written to Kezia, who is the director of the Institute, to say that, you know, at an early stage we would very much welcome a meeting to see how we can get involved in that programme. And I'm hoping these are paid placements as well. I need to clarify that. But it is a 9-month programme, and through that we should be able to bring people into the Parliament. It's a great place to come, and it's great for people to have that on their CV if they have the opportunity to do that. So hopefully through that, you know, it may come of something. Inclusion Scotland was the first year. It was only the first year. We tried it, we tested it. It worked great. You know, 4 or 5 years later, we're still doing it. And it's been great to see some of those disabled people get permanent posts. And one of our disabled people that was on the internship actually got a permanent post in the committee. So we're absolutely delighted.
As a small follow-up on that, actually, just on that point, because I'm very keen to hear of the efficacy of these schemes, because it's all very well and good to have an internship programme, but if it doesn't then translate to actual employment, then it's not really worth the candle. I had the benefit of an Inclusion Scotland intern, and I then gave her a permanent post. How often does that happen? And can you see it working as well for a scheme which involved black and minority ethnic people?
Yes, and that's the benefit of our temporary resourcing pool. As I said, 27% of black and minority ethnic people have come through that. And that temporary resourcing pool allows, you know, if somebody did come in to do a placement in the Parliament, there may be an opportunity through that to then find a post for them here. So we have avenues in which we can, you know, bring people into the organisation, whether it's a fixed term or a permanent contract. But you're absolutely right that it has to be sustainable, and to find ways in which we can make sure that these posts make sure that there can be further support or look at further ways in which they can be recruited into the Parliament through the different measures that we take.
Great. Final question, if I may, Convener. Just for both of you, thinking about the recruitment processes of the Parliament when you are recruiting staff to the organisation, what sort of mechanisms do you have to capture the reasons why people are unsuccessful? What deep dive data analysis do you do to make sure that there isn't an unconscious bias in recruitment? And what feedback do you offer candidates, particularly from black and ethnic minority backgrounds?
Yes, I'd like to answer that one. That's okay. Yes, we are very mindful of that. We should be looking at those who have been unsuccessful and why. And, you know, as I mentioned previously, we do have the recruitment candidate system that allows us to look through that and to be able to monitor that at every stage in the process. I think one of the things I would like to say is the whole point of why we made our commitment to Black and minority ethnic people coming into the workforce was year on year. We looked at our application rates and our success rates in 2013, 14, 2012, 13, 14, and which highlighted that we had few applications coming in from Black and minority ethnic people. So that then was the trigger for us and to make that commitment. And we have had that commitment, you know, these last 5 years to be able to deliver on that. So the data does tell us, you know, what we need to know and how to inform our policy decisions for the future. And this data is reviewed by our leadership group and by our corporate body as well on an annual basis to help inform policy decisions around this.
No more. Thanks.
If I may just go back to the dignity at work policy, which has been mentioned. Your submission refers to that policy and that it would introduce a zero tolerance approach to harassment, bullying and discrimination, and maybe create a central point for reporting all formal complaints. It was expected to be in place for October. Can you tell the committee a little bit more about the policy and if it's still on course to be implemented in October, please? David.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it's not still on target to be implemented in October. Leadership group met just last week to review progress with it. It has been out to consultation. That consultation so far has not elicited any responses to it, which gives us a bit of concern. But I think that's a factor of people not being in the organisation and being very much focused on supporting core parliamentary business. So the decision we took at Leadership Group last week was to extend that consultation period until January and put another big push behind it. So as part of the work that I mentioned earlier in terms of surveying people, again, in terms of wellbeing in November, we'll then re-advertise the fact that this policy is out for consultation and we do need to hear from people. We don't want to take silence as consent to the draft that we've taken, so another big push behind that. But I think it's important we do take that extra time to make sure that the changes we make to it are evidence-based.
We have heard from other witnesses about people feeling a bit over-consulted at the moment. I don't know if that maybe reflects that we're all online so much more in our working days. That completes and concludes our questions for this morning. Thank you both very much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. We'll now briefly suspend while we set up for panel 2. Welcome back and good morning to witnesses on our second panel, Jamie Hepburn, Minister for Business, Fair Work and Skills, and Mandy Watts, Directorate for Fair Work, Employability and Skills with the Scottish Government. Thank you for both being here this morning to answer questions on behalf of the Scottish Government and its outward-facing policy role. I intend to allow up to 45 minutes for this panel, so again would ask participants to be as succinct as possible in their contribution. And Minister, with that said, if I could invite you to make a brief opening statement, please.
Certainly, Convener. I'd like to start by thanking the committee for the opportunity to contribute today. I recognise that this is an extremely important topic, and I very much welcome the focus on race equality and employment and skills that your work is providing. As Minister for Business, Fair Work and Skills, I'm keen to ensure that race equality is embedded through all aspects of my portfolio, and I'm very confident the findings from your inquiry will help sharpen this focus. Given that the pandemic has highlighted some real systemic inequalities and the disproportionate impact it has had on minority ethnic communities and workers, I am keen to do what I can across my area of responsibility to ensure that race inequality is tackled through fair work practice, our investment in skills, our work with employers, businesses and trade unions. I know that work in this area has not progressed as well as we had expected or hoped, and of course that this has been made worse because of the pandemic. That's why I think this inquiry provides an opportunity to not only look at the issues we knew existed before, but to consider how we move forward, given what we have gone through over the past 6 months. And with that, Convener, I would close just by saying I know that there's still a lot that needs to be done, and I am very glad to be here with you today to hear from you in terms of what you've considered of your inquiry so far, and to field any questions you might have for me.
Thank you, Minister. If I could start, please. The minority ethnic employment gap has been at 15% for the past decade. What is there in the race equality framework or programme for government that's going to change that?
In terms of the programme for government, I think this goes back to the point that I've just made. The programme for government is very much placed in the current context of the pandemic and how we respond to the pandemic. In the area of employment and employability, we have set out a significant range of investments to support people who might fall out of the labour market back into the labour market, and indeed those who are out with the labour market, and we know that disproportionately those from a minority ethnic background are disproportionately out of the labour market to access the opportunity to get into work. So that's why, through an investment of £100 million to look at those at risk of redundancy as a result of COVID-19, will make a difference. The £2.35 million to the Parental Employability Support Fund will make a difference. We are committed to taking forward a recruitment toolkit designed to support employers to better recruit more people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And of course, we are working with the John Smith Centre to fund up to 50 places on a leadership development programme for minority ethnic people. These are all laid out within our programme for government and are a further iteration of commitments we've made in the race equality framework.
Thank you. Mandy, would you wish to add anything to that?
I think that's
okay.
Everything.
You're both very far away, so if I get you to wave at me if you wish to come in on any of these questions. Minister, how's the race equality framework taken into account COVID-19, please?
Well, I think hopefully the points I've made are a reflection of that particular concern, but we have also taken account of the current situation with the expert reference group on COVID-19 and ethnicity, which was formed back in June. That's directly, of course, in response to the current situation we are in. They have submitted their initial advice and recommendations. And again, a number of the commitments that I've referred to in the programme for government arise out of the work that they have undertaken. for example, reviewing the past and current initiatives to tackle systemic racism, looking at making ethnicity a mandatory field for health databases, developing a link in the census, embedding the process of ethnicity data collection in the culture of the NHS in Scotland, which all have a direct relevance to our better understanding some of the systemic challenges we face, and then we can apply our thinking in relation to the sphere of employment and employability based on the information that we gather. And then, of course, I go back to points I made about the significant investment in the sphere of employability that we are undertaking. And I can also refer to some of the work that we've done through Fair Start Scotland, where we have prioritised access for those from a minority ethnic background. Of course, we've still to respond to the reference group in full, so we will be doing that in due course.
You preempted my next question there. I'll move on to Fulton McGregor, please.
Thank you, Convener. And good morning, Minister. You mentioned there about the reference group and taking into account. And one of the things, obviously, that came through that, and there was a debate in the Parliament the other day, is that ethnic minorities are disproportionately impacted by the health effects of COVID-19. Now, a question that's been raised with me several times is, do you think that employers need to have specific and individualised risk assessment for BME workers returning to work based on this information?
The long answer short, Convener, and thank you for the question, Mr McGregor, is yes, I do. And we've sought to take account of that already through the raft of guidance that we have put in place for various sectors of the economy, with this explicit reference to that being an important area for employers to consider, because we know there is that concern amongst the minority ethnic community, because we have seen data published that shows there is a disproportionate impact. So we must take account of that, and employers have to consider that and work with their workforce to make sure that they are involved in the process of a safe return to work. That's a general point for the whole workforce, but in relation to the specific point that Mr McGregor makes, yes, I agree with the point he makes, and we've taken account of that in the guidance that we've published.
Thanks for that, Minister. And I suppose in a more substantial question, and going back to your opening remarks, do you think that the commitment in the programme for government, do they form part of the race equality framework?
I didn't quite catch the
Fulton, can I ask
question.
you to ask that again? Sorry, we didn't quite catch that.
Yeah, no bother, Convener. I do think I've not got the best signal here today. Can I ask the Minister, going back to his earlier statement, his opening statement, does he think that the commitments in the programme for government form part of the race equality framework?
Oh, I beg, but yes. Yes, I mean, hopefully in opening and in answer to the first question, yes, very much so, but in relation to everything that we're seeking to do across government in relation to ensuring better outcomes, more equal outcomes, then we have to look at everything we're doing through the prism of that particular framework. So, and what we seek to take forward, we obviously cross-refer to what we've committed to doing and the outcomes that we're seeking.
Thank you. Can I bring in Mary Fee, please?
Convener, and good morning, Minister. Can I ask you about the Fair Work Action Plan, because that's aimed at boosting productivity by developing Scotland as a world-leading fair work nation. How does the plan address the ethnic employment gap?
In various ways. One, probably the most practical way, Ms Fee, is through the development of the Fair Work First principles, which are those that we have laid out, where we demand certain things from employers in return for public investment. So that started with regional selective assistance being provided from Scottish enterprise to various companies. And there are various strands that employers have to commit to in order to be able to draw down on that funding. And the one with particular relevance is action to tackle the gender pay gap and create a more diverse and inclusive workplace. So they have to commit to doing that, otherwise you ain't getting the funding, basically. And we started with regional selective assistance, and we're now working forward to see how we can further roll out Fair Work First across a wider range of public investment. So that's work that's ongoing, and I'd be very happy to provide more information to the committee as to where we've got to with that. As with most areas of work, it has been interrupted a little by COVID-19, but it remains a very important part of our agenda to make sure everyone's experience of the world of work is a high quality one, and also that we can tackle some of the systemic challenges that we've seen in our labour market, the gender pay gap, the disability employment gap, and also the underrepresentation of those from minority ethnic backgrounds in the labour market as well.
Thank you for your response, Minister. That was very helpful. And it may be helpful to the committee if you could provide a bit more information on the ongoing work. Because I suppose just a very brief further supplementary would be, how do you make sure that within that Fair Work action plan that it's almost constantly updated, because the diversity of the workforce and what they need will change, and it will need to adapt and change as things progress. So I suppose, how do you keep that alive through the programme?
I totally agree with the point, and that's something that we've said at the outset. One of the things that we're seeking to do is make sure that the area of fair work isn't viewed in a silo or through the prism of only the economy portfolio. It has much wider relevance across government, and to that end I chair a working group, ministerial working group, with a number of colleagues from across government to make sure that each area of their activity is focusing on fair work. But by its very nature, when we come together, we can talk about some of the challenges that are emerging, some of the things that we haven't foreseen, and then we can go back and question our initial assumptions and make sure that the Fair Work Action Plan is always remaining up to date. And I go back to the point I made a moment ago in looking at how we take forward the next iteration of Fair Work First. We're also looking at the commitments we've made to see, where do they sit in relation to the world as is through the experience of COVID-19. So we're looking at that across the board in relation to our Fair Work agenda, and I think it's personally a very important thing to do, because the world as it is not as the world as was, and the world that will be is probably not the world as is just now, if that's not too convoluted a thing to say. I think I knew what I meant.
No, okay. Yes, I did as well. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Alison Harris, please.
Morning. The Fair Work Agreement was signed in November 2018 by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Economy and Fair Work and the recognised civil service trade unions. The Scottish Government states that it illustrates the commitment to embedding fair work into local employment policy and practice in the civil service sector. So I would like to ask, what impact has this had on recruiting and retraining staff from ethnic communities within our civil service?
The first thing to say is that I think it's welcome that we've worked with our trade union partners to make sure that everyone's on the same page and we're moving forward, and there's that collective commitment to that particular agenda. It does have wide applicability, certainly for our own core workforce. It also covers a wide range of public bodies that are included and incorporated within the main workforce, also Scottish Prison Service, Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service, Register Scotland, and the Courts and Tribunal Service. So it has a wide scope, which I think is welcome. In terms of some of the practical differences it's making, I think you'll probably explore some of this in greater detail in your next session, incidentally, because of course ministers were responsible for many things, but the direct employment practice within government. The civil service obviously has the greater role there. But that said, we clearly work with them to make sure government policy is being applied. So I can tell you that through 2018, through Band B recruitment, 7.9% of applicants were for a Band B2 role were from an ethnic minority background. Of the 440 interviewed, just under 6% were ethnic minority people. In the Graduate Development Programme 2019, 300 applicants were identified as ethnic minority people. 10% of candidates invited to interview identified as ethnic minority people. And the percentage of candidates identifying as ethnic minority people in the final cohort of 20 is significantly greater than the Scottish population average. So hopefully that's an indication that we are taking this seriously. But I think at your next panel, you will probably be able to explore that better with Claire Marr and Usma Khan, who will be able to give you more information about what's happening.
Thank you, Minister.
Gillian Martin.
Morning, Minister. Obviously, the Fair Work Agreement and the fact it's been signed up to by public bodies, and you've addressed what's going on in the civil service there. But what tools are available to the Scottish Government when it comes to employers more generally, like in the private sector? I mean, we want as many employers out there to be signing up to the Fair Work principles and to be recruiting and retaining people from BAME communities as much as possible. So where are the levers for the Scottish Government in encouraging that?
Well, I've obviously referred to one particular area where we do have some ability to influence these things through the investment that we deploy. So we have that leverage. Clearly, there's undeniably restrictions in our ability to do these things through the blunt instrument of any form of legislative vehicle, because employment law continues to be reserved. Clearly, it won't surprise anyone on this committee that the Scottish Government's perspective, and the perspective of others, such as the Scottish Trades Union Congress, is that it should be the responsibility of this Parliament to legislate for. That's not the case. So, it not being the case, we don't rest on our laurels and we go out and we engage with employers and we try to bring them with us on this journey. The good news, I think, is that most employers want to do the right thing. Most employers, when you broach the subject with them, are keen to be involved. Sometimes they'll bring up areas about some of the particular challenges they consider they might face in taking forward fair work. And what we do is we engage with them and try and work out how do we overcome those barriers. So it's really a process, short of having the ability to legislate for certain things. It's about the process of engaging, getting people to come with you on the journey that you're seeking to undertake. So there's obviously limitations as to how far that might take you, but it's one that we're determined to continue to progress. It's one that we're very serious about, and it's one that we engage with employers on a wide-ranging basis across all parts of fair work, and this area of activity that you're investigating and looking at through this inquiry is a very important strand of that fair work agenda.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, you've talked about the vitally important engagement, and that is very much the case. So can I ask about the Fair Work Action Plan, how it is monitored in relation to the impact of equality and diversity?
So, I would go back to the point I would make in terms of our own process of monitoring what might be happening across government. We do that at meeting as a group of ministers to consider what opportunities might exist within government and also with the various agencies and bodies that each area of government's interacting with. But we don't just mark our own cards, so we'll report on an annual basis as to where the Fair Work Action Plan is getting to. So we'll report on the progress we've made, we'll report on some of the challenges that we are still experiencing. So that's published, it's made publicly available, and the committee would of course be able to look at that, and if they wanted to ask any form of questions around it. So I'd be very happy to provide details of the last report and to let you know when the next one's due, which I can't remember off the top of my head.
That's
I'm
all
afraid,
right.
Convener.
And you talked about the Fair Work working group that's been set up. Does it look at the monitoring, or does it look at the perception that there might be and the reputation of the Fair Work Plan as to how it's perceived in the aspects of equality and diversity?
There's probably not something that working group that I've referred to probably looks at, but it's certainly something that I, as the Minister for Fair Work, and Fiona Hislop as the Cabinet Secretary for Fair Work, take a keen interest in, and it's why we engage widely with all the various partners that we have on the Fair Work agenda. So we obviously have the Fair Work Convention, who are an independent organisation. We provide them the funding, and they keep us honest, as it were, in terms of the Fair Work agenda. They will not be shy in telling us where they think we could be doing better, or areas of activity that we've not probably looked at and considered. Obviously engage with the STUC about these matters and individual unions. We engage with the third sector about these matters. We engage with business organisations. So it's a constant process of engagement, and having set a range of commitments within the Fair Work Action Plan, we of course continue to look and report as to where we're getting to with the commitments we've made. And the engagement is wide and varied. Sometimes it's with organisations who will be candid with you and say we could be doing rather better. Sometimes it's us with organisations telling them they could be doing rather better. So it's all different forms of dialogue.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Minister, and good morning, Mandy Watts as well. Thank you for coming to see us. My questions are predominantly for the Minister, but please feel free to interject as well, Mandy. Firstly, I'd just like to know, in terms of your work as Minister for Business, Fair Work and Skills, what is the kind of reporting that happens to you about rates of employment within Scottish society as they are regards the percentage of black and ethnic minority people who are successful in entering the labour market? And how often do you get a readout of those statistics?
So there is a specific team within the Fair Work Directorate that Mandy is part of that has been specifically set up to look at this area of activity. So it'll be the constant process of getting an update from Mandy and her colleagues as to where we're getting to with the work that we've set ourselves through the annual population survey, through the labour market statistics that are available. We can see what the outcomes are in respect of labour market outcomes. So that's how we monitor progress or otherwise in terms of some of the challenges that we've set ourselves. But in terms of the area of government activity, it's the process of getting updates from civil servants proactively from them, or if I feel I need an update, I'll ask them for one.
In which case, Mandy, may I ask you, if you're responsible for sort of that environment scanning, that dashboard, if you like, are you able to see a pull-through of interventions or initiatives and upticks or declines in relative employment for black and ethnic minority workers?
The work that we do with our analytic colleagues is continuous, and the questions that I pose there are challenges within the statistics that come out in terms of the employment rate itself, the gap, while we have that figure, there is a lot more behind that figure as to why there is such a gap. One of the possible reasons behind that, in my conversations with analytic colleagues, is that that gap could be driven by a higher proportion of people from minority ethnic backgrounds in higher education. So it's complicated in terms of, you know, drawn out overarching general figures in terms of trends, because there are varying factors underneath those figures that, you know, that explain a bit more of the complexities behind it. Further on from that, possible reason is that we need to explore more why there is a higher proportion. Is it because in education? Is it because minority ethnic people are moving in that direction because there is a barrier being faced in employment? And I think that's come through in research as well, where we've seen a report from Radiant and Brighter, who give case studies of people who have been unable to access an employment and return to education. So the stats, when you look at the stats overall, that we need to, I'm learning that we need to dig deeper underneath those stats to actually understand why we have those figures that we do.
Final question, if I may. So we understand that if we want our workforce to better reflect the society in which we live, we need the boardrooms that govern that workforce to better reflect the society in which we live. This Parliament and this committee, in fact, has stewarded legislation through to better reflect gender representation on public boards, which is the one sort of purview that we can have control over. What consideration has the government given to enacting similar legislation to ensure that there is at least some representation of black and ethnic minority people in our boardrooms?
I mean, it's something we're always open to propositions that will seek to advance better representation in public boards, public bodies. We want them to reflect our society. In terms of what we can and can't legislate for, we need to see if that's compliant with wider equality law. But of course, these are things we will look at. That said, what we are doing, and I guess this goes back to the point I made earlier in response to, I think it was Ms Martin's question around what do we have control over in terms of legislative mechanisms by comparison to just recognising there's a problem and getting on with trying to resolve it. So through the race equality action plan, there is some activity here to try and make sure that we see better diversity on our public sector bodies. That's done through a variety of ways. There's mentoring for people who are interested in taking up chair roles, for example. Part of the rationale behind the leadership programme that I alluded to earlier, that the John Smith Centre is taking forward, that we are funding, is very much looking at the area of leadership in public life. So that will have applicability here as well. And the positive thing that, and I'm not suggesting that by any stretch of the imagination we have achieved the outcome we want to see, and we can provide more information on this if it would be helpful to the committee. We are seeing improvements in the rate of application from those who are underrepresented on public boards, from women, from disabled people and from minority ethnic people. So more are coming forward to seek appointment, but then ultimately we can only be measured by the outcome and those boards themselves being more reflective. The other thing I would observe, of course, is that there's a role for all of us involved in public life. You know, the institution that we are all privileged to be elected to is not particularly representative of the wider Scottish population, and that's something we all have a responsibility to take head on and to make sure that collectively we're doing rather better in terms of performance and outcome.
Thank you. No further questions.
Minister, I wonder just to finish, I don't know if you had the opportunity to hear the previous session. We have been asked... No.
Apologies.
No worries. I want to just ask you about institutional racism. We've been asking witnesses about it, and there seems to be a broad acceptance that this is a societal problem. In opening, you spoke about the employment toolkits that government will be being developed. I just wonder if institutional racism will be considered in developing those, if that's something that you will look at.
It will have to be. I mean, this is a form of terminology, I think, that makes many people uncomfortable, understandably so, because clearly institutional racism at its worst is overt discrimination and overt racism, but my understanding of the term is it encompasses much more than that, and it includes unconscious bias, and it includes systemic barriers that might be put in place for individuals through any institution. And whether we like it or not, we can see through the outcomes in our society, and this specific instance in the inquiry you're undertaking in terms of labour market outcomes, there has to be some form of institutional racism as defined in the terms that I have laid out. So in terms of the toolkit that we'll seek to develop, whether or not we use that term overtly or not, and I'm not saying we won't, incidentally, we certainly need to be looking at it through that prism. How do we work with employers? And I go back to the point I made earlier. I think most employers want to do the right thing. They're just not always sure how to go about doing the right thing. And that's the very purpose of the toolkit, is to work with them to make sure that collectively each element of our society, in this instance employers, is making sure that we can see fairness for all of our citizens, and in this case for minority ethnic people in the labour market.
In opening, you spoke to the programme for government, and I know that it's been praised as having race equality woven through all portfolios. There is an undertaking in there to do an audit of past and current initiatives to tackle systemic racism. Are you able to expand on that commitment for the committee this morning?
Well, beyond the fact that we've committed to doing it and we will get on with it, probably not really, Convener. It's not likely to be me that leads directly on that work. So I think we'd need to probably ask those who will be looking at it to provide you more information. So I'll be happy to take that away and make sure we do that.
Thank you. That would be very helpful. Okay, I think that concludes questions. I'm not seeing anyone else looking to come in. Can I thank you very much for your time this morning, Minister, and Mandy, thank you for coming as well. We'll now suspend briefly while we change panels. Welcome back and good morning to the witnesses on our third panel who are joining us remotely and representing the Scottish Government as an employer. Claire Marr, Deputy Director, People Development within People Directorate, and Usma Khan, Deputy Director for Economic Policy and Capability, Scottish Government. Thank you for being with us this morning. For the purposes of this panel, I'd remind members if your question is addressed to a specific witness, please identify them by name. Otherwise, I will invite Claire to respond first, to be followed by Usma. Witnesses, if you feel that your colleague is better placed to answer the question, then please just indicate as such. If you wait a second before speaking to allow broadcasting to turn on your microphone as well, please. I expect this panel session to last for no more than 45 minutes and would ask that questions and answers are kept as succinct as possible. And if I may start with the first question. You said in your submission to the committee that in response to COVID-19, you're making sure that minority ethnic staff feel safe and that their needs are met. Can you explain to the committee what you have done both in the short term and what you plan to do in the longer term? And if I could go to Claire first, please. Claire.
Thank you, Convener. So I think as with most organisations, the organisation rapidly moved to a home working situation within 48 hours when the crisis emerged. We immediately provided a range of advice and guidance to colleagues on home working and general wellbeing in that context. That also included regular senior leadership blogs, highlighting the importance of wellbeing and looking after one another. We also had a dedicated session with the National Clinical Director to respond to questions and concerns from colleagues. We spent a huge amount of time exploring insights. So from our home working and wellbeing surveys, we know for ethnic minorities that their wellbeing scores were slightly different than other populations. COVID-19 related absences were higher. They were less likely to feel supported by their teams. They were more positive about working from home from a productivity perspective, but they were less satisfied with their workplace adjustments. We also researched and gathered data and information on the impact of COVID-19 and found that, as we all know, there's a disproportionate impact on minority ethnic colleagues. And as a result of that, there were more issues with their well-being. But that research also highlighted very clearly that in an organisation that was operating incredibly fast-paced under a huge amount of pressure, there was an increased risk of bias coming into decision-making. So in terms of some of the actions that we took in the short term, we saw very strong leadership from the Permanent Secretary, who had regular discussions with our executive team on the impact that COVID was having, particularly on minority ethnic colleagues. We enhanced our existing employee assistance offering so that minority ethnic colleagues have the options to request a counsellor from a similar background. And we actually extended that for all our protected characteristics. We have in-house wellbeing counsellors, and we also delivered training to them to make sure that they had increased understanding and awareness of the cultural sensitivities and the lived experiences of our minority ethnic colleagues. We produced evidence packs on the differential impact that COVID was having, and that in turn resulted in wellbeing and occupational risk assessment forms for managers, so that they could sit down and have a discussion and understand the needs and the risks and agree how they could be managed. And finally, we've produced an Equalities self-reflection toolkit for leaders to help them equality impact assess their decisions. At the same time, we obviously saw a huge amount of coverage of the Black Lives Movement. And as a result of that, we saw the executive team with the Permanent Secretary have a round table with our Race Equality Network. And at that, we heard from minority ethnic colleagues about how they were currently feeling in the organisation. In summary, I would say that they felt fatigued. They were very tired of having to share their lived experiences and explain themselves and educate colleagues that the understanding and experiences they have are very, very real. And some of them didn't feel safe to return to the workplace. Following that, the Race Equality Network spent a lot of time engaging with different senior leadership teams across the organisation to help them gain a better insight and understanding of how our minority ethnic colleagues were feeling. In terms of an action taken as a result of that, Scottish Government decided to adapt the UK Civil Service Starter for 10 Action Plan on Race. So this is a forerunner to the work that we had scheduled in for later in the year, called the Race Recruitment and Retention Action Plan. We developed that in very close partnership with the Race Equality Network, and our unions also gave input to that. Do you want me to stop?
Claire, I'll just pause you there for a second because I think colleagues will wish to probe on some of those things. If I may ask you about counselling, that came out as one of the actions that you'd taken. Based on what Black minority ethnic employees had told you about their feelings about, you said your wellbeing survey, was counselling something that they specifically requested? Does your wellbeing survey give employees the opportunity to say what it is they need to feel their wellbeing has improved, for example?
It does give the opportunity, yes, but we're constantly looking at our wellbeing offering and identifying ways that we can improve that. And obviously that was a key activity for us in light of COVID in general. However, when we saw the results of the wellbeing for minority ethnic colleagues and some of their other protected characteristic groups, we felt that it was important that they had a counsellor who they could relate to a little bit more because of shared experiences.
I suppose what I'm trying to understand is, did you ask people what they needed? As an organisation, did you ask them what they needed, or was it the decision taken that counselling was the answer to these issues and things people were feeling?
Yes, that was a decision that was taken, yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Very good from the audio
Sure.
output.
Okay, we'll get that sorted. If I may come to Fulton McGregor now, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. The Scottish Government in its submission refers to the Race Recruitment and Retention Plan, and as part of that submission states that a core ambition is to tackle structural racism and to take an anti-racist approach. Now, as a committee, we've been asking witnesses whether their organisation have ever considered institutional racism when developing recruitment policies. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the Scottish Government's approach to this. We heard a wee bit from the Minister, Jamie Hepburn, there towards the end of the session, but I wonder if you could elaborate on the Government's approach, and particularly around how public authorities can learn from it and other sectors as well. Thanks.
If I can come to Uzma first, and if you want to briefly comment on my opening question as well, that might be helpful. Thank you.
Hi there. I'll begin by commenting on the original question that you asked of Claire, and I'm going to give this answer from the perspective of the race champion in the Scottish Government, of which I'm one of two, and also as a member of the Race Equality Network. So I felt quite immediately in the short term we were able to get a good grasp of some of the issues that our minority ethnic staff were feeling as a result of the impacts of COVID on ethnic minority communities, but also the result of the death of George Floyd. We were able to do this in a number of ways, and I think one of the most important things perhaps to highlight is a really strong relationship that the Race Equality Network has with our kind of most senior leaders. And at the start of the crisis, we were able to bring our network together, which has around 200 members and has grown significantly in members over the last couple of years, to really create a safe space where people could share how they were feeling and talk openly about how they felt being in an organisation that was responsible for responding to COVID on a policy basis, but also as staff members within that organisation. And from those sessions, it was actually one of the most well-attended Race Equality Network sessions we've had in years. 147 staff joined the call. And I was really taken aback by the honesty and the emotions that came out of that meeting. So staff were able to say why they felt fatigued, how they felt a personal sense of responsibility working in government as minority ethnic people, how they felt they might be able to influence policy making, and raised issues around how their voices might be heard in the context of policy making and responding to some of the issues affecting minority ethnic staff and our communities as well. And it was off the back of that that we were able to hold 2 special sessions with our executive team and permanent secretary, who took the time out to listen to personal testimonies on the impact of staff. And Claire had mentioned the offer around counselling and wellbeing support as well. And this is again something that our members had said when it had been signposted that this was available. They'd asked specifically if we could be given minority ethnic counsellors that would understand our cultural needs and our more kind of specific requirements, and that safe space where we could share our feelings a bit more openly. So I think that is really crucial, being able to hear the voices of the staff in your organisation, being able to create that safe space where people are allowed and feel able to express how they're feeling, and their role in that organisation is absolutely critical in recognising the short-term actions that you should take. So I think, sorry.
Thank you. Yes, I was just going to say, if you're able to pick up on Fulton McGregor's question now, please, about the race recruitment and retention plan.
Yeah, because I think as an organisation, we absolutely recognise that we're not immune to some of the systemic and kind of structural racism that exists in our society, and we as an organisation in the context of our race recruitment plan have to proactively really try and understand how we dismantle this. And I think the first step to this is really understanding that and acknowledging that structural racism exists, and it's reflected across a whole number of indicators that we're picking up in our evidence around progression, how people feel, bullying, harassment, discrimination. And I think once we're able to do that, we need to be able to challenge ourselves to look for where those root causes and those issues are stemming from, and not just look at the usual places where we might go, because we know we haven't seen change in many years, but where are the things that we really need to probe to get a better understanding of how we might start to dismantle some of those structures that exist. And our Minister talked about challenging ourselves, challenging our unconscious bias, and being really open to change. And I think in terms of the race recruitment plan, what we are doing is looking proactively at where those opportunities for bias and racism might exist, whether overtly or not. And this is looking and probing into how we're delivering training, looking at diverse panels, looking at how we might implement kind of name blind SIFT trials and as part of our recruitment process, and looking a bit more broadly. I think you also asked about how kind of other public authorities might learn from us. I think there's a real opportunity to work on this together, to really understand where best practice exists, and to try and tackle this in a way that surfaces some of the issues that we want to get to the heart of.
Usma, I'll pause you as well. With the other members will probably come in and want to ask a bit more about that. Claire, if I could bring you in on Fulton's question, please.
With the Graduate Development Programme in 2019, we had developed a strategy for attracting a very diverse candidate pool. And from the research that we did for that certainly highlighted a need to educate, so help potential candidates understand what it meant to work in Scottish Government, engage them, make sure they felt welcome, and also deliver experiences through real tangible action. For that, we worked with our Race Equality Network, but also a number of external race organisations to shape our approach. That included Bemis, Kembo and Radiate and Brighter. And working with those partners, they certainly provided counsel to us in terms of ensuring that the approach we took was incredibly diverse and inclusive, and also on occasion provided some constructive challenge to us. They also were invaluable in helping to profile the programme and the opportunities that it gave to colleagues through their own networks. In terms of the overall approach that was taken, we set out from the very start of that campaign some explicit diversity key performance indicators around about achieving representation from underrepresented groups that were at least similar to the population average. We also ensured that in our marketing for that campaign, we used minority ethnic role models. And we also used social media to target specific areas that were likely to be more commonly used by minority ethnic colleagues. We spent particular care over selection, because we know that is an area where there can be an opportunity for bias to come in. And in that respect, we worked very closely with the Government Recruitment Services team to do that. And we spent particular time monitoring diversity right the way throughout the process, as well as reviewing candidate feedback. To ensure that we had good diversity on our panels, we engaged the Race Equality Network, and they took part in that. And we also provided interview training for the panel, which included a section on unconscious bias. I think that's one example of where we spent a lot of focus in it. I would absolutely say that in terms of our broader recruitment activity, so non-campaign based, we recognise that that is an area that we need to focus on more going forward. It's currently a key element of the plan I referred to.
Claire, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but I think I need to try and keep us focused on. I know there's a lot of information to give, and there's clearly a lot of good work going on, but we need to keep the answers quite succinct so that I can bring in other members. Fulton, if I could come to you and just ask, do you feel that your question's been covered there? Are you content if I move on?
Yeah, convener, quite robust answer. Quite happy for you to move on. Thank you.
Okay, if I could bring in Mary Fee, please.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, panel. I wanted to ask the panel about their views on having a public accountability event where public authorities can talk about what they've done or they're planning to do to help increase the diversity of their workforce, and the committee and stakeholders can ask questions and hold them to account. And the aim of the event would be to develop shared outcomes or an action plan. Do the panel think those kind of events are worthwhile?
Claire, if we could come to you, please, on that specific point about a public accountability event.
I think there's always huge value in having the opportunity to exchange information, both where you've had successes and also maybe where things have not worked quite so well. I think the Minister's right, it's really important that there's clear outcomes, and I think also follow through from the event in terms of something tangible. I would just probably be thoughtful about the timing of that, just given some of the pressures that I think organisations are under just now as a result of COVID-19.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Usma, would you have anything to add on that?
On that, I think it's most helpful when it's not just seen as a tick box exercise, but it offers a real opportunity to surface blind spots that we might not see that other communities can see better than us.
Thank you. Mary.
No, I'm content with that. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Mary. Alison Harris, can I bring you in now, please?
Good morning. The Scottish Government has a vision to be a world-leading diverse employer and is committed to race equality and inclusion. It works with race-based organisations on recruitment, and for its modern apprenticeship programme, it targets minority ethnic students. What other approaches have been taken, and why have they been successful?
Claire, if we come to you first.
Thank you. So I won't go over again, but I think part of the answer I gave talking about the graduate development programme is a good example of that. The one I would turn to now is the Future Leaders Diversity Conference. So this is a positive action initiative where the aim is to raise the profile of the graduate development programme that's run in the Scottish Government, as well as other civil service graduate opportunities. It's specifically targeted at minority ethnic colleagues, minority ethnic people, disabled individuals, and those from a socially economic disadvantaged background. In 2019, we had 35 attendees, and it received extremely positive feedback, particularly on the opportunity to have open door access to the organisation and find out more about its role and get advice on preparing for applications. We also assigned an ongoing Scottish Government mentor to each individual, and again, individuals found that hugely beneficial. We plan to hold an event later in 2020, albeit it will be online, obviously, and this time we are aiming to have around about 60 participants on that.
Usma, do you have anything to add on Alison's question there, please?
Yeah, just to build on that, we also take part on our Career Ready scheme, which is through a social mobility organisation and targets certain protected characteristic groups that we're interested in outreaching to. When we've taken them on, I've actually personally spoken to a few that have come in, and actually just gaining their experience and their understanding of the journey into that internship and how they found the place has been really valuable, again, in reminding us how many barriers actually exist just to get people in through the doors, and hearing from the difficulties and challenges people face just on an everyday basis in terms of entry and access. And we also take part in a number of race conferences as well, so we host our own every year. We've brought in school pupils to showcase to the rest of our organisation what they think about the civil service, what comes into their mind when they think of the civil service as an employer. And we spent a lot of time trying to improve the culture of our organisation, so we have ambassadors who are staff that can go out and credibly say to the communities that actually this is a good place to work and it is a flourishing environment for our staff. So we invest a lot in the culture. And just looking through our programme events for the Race Equality Network this month, we've got an Allies event, we've got a book club that helps talk about race. There's a whole number of things that we're doing to really think about actually how we project ourselves as an inclusive and diverse organisation.
Thank you. Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Convener. You're clearly doing an awful lot in terms of positive action, and you've talked about quite a lot of the programmes in response to other colleagues. Can I ask you how you assess how successful they are working with people that have been through them? And also, as people move on in the government and you look at their retention and their progression, how do you assess how well that is happening in the organisation?
Claire, please.
Okay, so as a focus initially on graduate development programme, we evaluated that at every stage of the process, as I mentioned, and we also absolutely asked applicants and candidates for their feedback on that. In terms of the lessons that we learned from that we've shared with other areas in the organisation, it was about the importance of being very, very clear on who you're targeting, and that a marketing strategy had to be tailored to the different channels to reach all the candidates. I mentioned before that the actual selection and the testing is a critical area because it's an opportunity where bias can come in, and as a result of that we made some changes. And at the offer and onboarding stage, which comes after selection, it has a very big impact on the impressions that are made to people who are joining the organisation. And finally, really, really important that you take the time to engage and help you understand the barriers that may be in place for applicants. In terms of the Future Leaders Conference that I referred to earlier, in terms of some of the feedback we got after seeking it from colleagues there, words such as inspiring, energising, demystifying and generating a warmth and connection to the Scottish Government were cited, and most intended to apply for the graduate development programme, and certainly most felt more prepared and confident as a result of that. And the bottom line impact was that 11% of attendees from the conference went on to secure either a place on the programme or a near miss appointment to Band B.
Claire, can I come back in and just ask you, I mean, obviously you're giving us a picture of what's worked and what measures you've taken. Is there any positive action measures that you have tried in the past that haven't worked and you've decided to move away from, and why?
I think I would have to check that. I'm respectful. I joined the organisation in late February, so I wouldn't have first-hand experience of that, but I'm very happy to go away and check that and come back to you.
I wonder if Usma has got any reflections on any of the questions that I've asked there around that.
Perhaps not directly on positive actions that we've moved away from, but just picking up on one of the points that Claire had made around really interrogating our graduate development programme and how that's been assessed as candidates go through the various stages of interview and recruitment. Those results are shared with the Race Equality Network, and we get a chance to peer review them from our point of view and challenge the government and our HR on what we think isn't working for ethnic minority colleagues. For example, we know that there's a higher dropout rate after psychometric testing, and this is something that we've pushed internally discussions on as to whether there's a better way to recruit on a basis that maybe looks at tests that might be a bit more fair, or really take into account things that might improve the chances of ethnic minority on an equal basis, as opposed to trying to understand, why do these things, why is there a greater dropout rate for certain groups at certain stages of the process. So I think our kind of HR colleagues have been really good at taking those things away and looking for better ways of implementing parts of the recruitment process.
Can I ask to just probe a little bit deeper on what you said about psychometric testing? You said that there was a dropout rate after psychometric testing, and having been through recruitment processes in the past myself, which that's been a factor. That's usually done even before an interview. What was your analysis of why that happened?
So I think it's a common. There's quite a lot of evidence that exists in the public domain around ethnic minority outcomes and psychometric testing as well, and it's not something that anybody I feel has a really strong handle on, and in understanding the reasons why. We know from our SIF process on the graduate development programme that as you move through the stages, you're absolutely right in saying that psychometric testing happens before you get to interview stage. What is the dropout rate between our application rate versus, what's the proportion of minority ethnics successful as they go through psychometric testing and then through to final interview. And it's about us understanding and trying to get a better handle of why certain groups or protected characteristics might fall out at certain stages. And we know, based on kind of the evidence that we've seen, there does seem to be a disproportionate impact at that stage of psychometric testing. And I know I'm going through the fast stream process myself, which relies quite heavily on that. That evidence also exists in that process. And I know my colleagues in HR have been trying to look at actually which sorts of tests might be better than the ones that we may have used in the past. So there's a whole range of psychometric tests you can use, from personality tests to numerical, etc. It's about trying to understand which works better. So,
and on that, so you've obviously identified that as an area of concern where people drop out. Does the organisation get in touch with those dropout candidates to try and ascertain what it was that has made them drop out? And similarly, do you contact unsuccessful recruits to maybe give them some feedback and assistance if they were to apply in the future?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I'll probably defer to Claire on whether we follow up with unsuccessful candidates throughout the recruitment process. But Claire, I don't know if you want to come in and shed a little bit more light on the practice we have in following up on unsuccessful candidates.
Yeah, that's fine. So for something like the graduate development programme or the Band B, which were both campaign approaches, then yes, we would absolutely go back to the candidates and give them an opportunity to give feedback.
Can I ask what sort of feedback you've got from them, and how that might have influenced practice? Because I suppose it's quite important that the folk that we're missing are as important as the folk that are catching and you're getting on board.
Yeah, so I think that there has previously been, and again, I would like to check this if that's okay, but I think there has been feedback in terms of, potentially needing to be a bit more clear on the kind of roles that they would be doing if they were successful and coming on to the programme. And I think that perhaps the criteria that was cited in the job descriptions in terms of desirable and essential could have been simplified a little bit.
Okay.
But again, I will double check and come back.
Thank you. We'd appreciate that. That would be helpful. Alexander Stewart, if I could bring you in, please.
Thank you, Convener. It's very obvious that the Scottish Government wants to do all it can to have a very diverse workforce. And training is a vital important part of that, to ensure that we do have diversity and equality going forward. So can I ask specifically about staff that join the organisation? What diversity and equality training new staff receive? What there would be then specific roles within the organisation? Are there any specific roles that require more diversity and equality training, and what kind of refreshers staff are given to ensure that they have an up-to-date understanding and a knowledge base of diversity and equality going through the organisation.
Claire, if we come to you first, please.
Two solutions that we currently offer and mandate for new colleagues. The first one is a digital learning solution from the UK Civil Service Learning Platform titled Diversity and Inclusion. And the second one is part of an event we hold for all new arrivals to the organisation called Foundation Day, which essentially introduces new colleagues to the organisation, its role. And in the D&I session on that, we actually have colleagues from ethnic minorities deliver that, and they give us an overview of the different types of discrimination that people may face, and also give an overview on the steps that the organisation is taking to build a more inclusive culture. Now, I'm very conscious you asked a couple of other questions. Would you be okay to repeat those?
Yes. Are there any roles within the organisation that require specific training on it, and what kind of refresher are given to employees who've been with the organisation for some time?
Okay, so on the first part, in terms of the roles, that is definitely an area that we are going to look at as part of our plans to refresh our overall diversity and inclusion education curriculum. At the moment, the feedback we get on the training is very positive, and that it's interesting and thought-provoking and informative, but it's not necessarily contextualised to individuals' roles, and obviously therefore maybe not as powerful. So again, that is an action that we've taken as part of our Starter for 10 action plan that we will look at. I think the point also in terms of, you know, how often do individuals have to refresh their training? Again, that's an area we've identified as something we want to look at as part of the D&I curriculum, because at the moment there is no need for it to be retaken either on an annual basis or something like that.
And you know, the culture of the organisation, its perception can be identified by individuals who want to join an organisation. But how do you reflect that within the training that you provide to ensure that the culture and the presentation and the perception is identified and is captured to ensure that individuals feel that within the training programme that you provide is actually giving the opportunity for them to participate and to see progress?
It's probably a little bit harder on the solution that we have from the UK Civil Service, because that is a generic programme developed and owned by them. I think it's much easier on our Foundation Day welcome event, because we control the content in that. And in terms of that content being developed, we do that in partnership, or we would consult with our different diversity and inclusion networks to get their input. And as I said, it is actually delivered by ethnic minority colleagues. So it's not just purely a diversity and inclusion team informed event and content.
Thank you, Convener.
Happy? Okay, thank you. Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to our colleagues from the government. I have two questions. Firstly, it's about the adoption of any schemes that you might have in the Scottish Government which might encourage people through internships. We know the Scottish Parliament already has an internship scheme with Inclusion Scotland for promoting employment opportunities for people with disabilities. Do you have something similar in the Scottish Government, and have you given any consideration to an internship scheme for people who are black or minority ethnic?
Claire.
So I think at the moment it's fair to say that we are doing a review of all our talent offering and capability offering for targeting specifically at minority ethnic colleagues. And again, we'll do that in partnership with the Race Equality Network. So we do recognise that, yes, we do some great stuff just now, some of which I've referenced, and we also draw on some of the programmes from the UK Civil Service, but there's certainly more to do. In terms of the internship piece, one of the things which we do participate in is the UK Civil Service Summer Diversity Internship Programme, which creates opportunities for students who identify as minority, ethnic, disabled or from socially disadvantaged backgrounds come in and get some experience. And we host a number of interns every year as an organisation.
Thank you very much. My second question, actually my final question as well, is about the processes that you adopt through HR so that you can do a deep dive, firstly into, or have a dashboard, as it were, as to how many people each year or each month that you're recruiting from black and ethnic minority backgrounds, but also what happens to the people who don't make it, who don't qualify or don't pass interview. What sort of internal review do you do as to the reasons for why, and what follow-up communication and feedback do you offer?
So I think we covered a wee bit of that in the last question, but if there's more to add, Claire?
So you really did, but I think it's actually, is there a best practice that we could reach for, or any other sort of industry standards you're looking at in this regard?
Claire, I think we'll come to you as the HR person. Claire.
Okay, so I think, again, yes, we do tend to do that when it is for campaign-based recruitment. I think when it is more business as usual, for our less senior roles, that is something that we want to look at doing more.
Okay, that's fine.
Usma, I wonder if you'd have anything to add on that from the perspective of your role.
Nothing more specific to add, except to say that for every recruitment we do have processes in place for local feedback. So every candidate, regardless of their protected characteristic, will get feedback on their application process if they've been unsuccessful. Okay,
thank you very much. That concludes our question and evidence session for this morning. We'd appreciate if you're able to send in the information that we spoke about earlier, and of course if there's anything that you didn't get the opportunity to say that you'd like to share with us, we'd welcome hearing that as well. Thank you very much, both of you, for taking part this morning. That concludes the public part of this morning's meeting. The next meeting of the committee will be on Thursday, the 1st of October, which will be our first oral evidence on pre-budget scrutiny 2021-22. And as previously agreed, we now move the meeting into private session. Thank you.